Going to pot. The push to make cannabis respectable. Political correctness is now into drugs. The problem is too big, so let's forget the whole thing, goes the argument. This was inevitable. The American anti-drug message was so closely linked with Nancy Reagan that it had to be unfashionable. And Australia trots along obediently after America in most things PC, except, of course, for obligatory denunciations of American cultural imperialism. In Australia, the big push is on to decriminalise or even legalise cannabis. Two arguments in this favour of this increasingly trendy stance are: number one, cannabis is not the real problem. Alcohol and tobacco cost the community far more, so why the fuss? These people have got to be kidding. What they are really saying is, legal drugs cost the community far more illegal ones, so let's make more drugs more legal. This is logical. Number two, prohibition did not work for alcohol, so it won't work for cannabis. Again, the logic escapes me. The problem with prohibition in America after the First World War was that it targeted a drug that was already legal and hence widely accepted, available and dispensed throughout society. So these people now want to create a similar problem with another drug. As for prohibition fostering organised crime, so apparently for the Dutch policy of drug liberalism, Holland, as I write, is attempting to tighten up its laws again. Young people have, at least until recently, seen the government's attitude to drugs as being hypocritical. The full weight of the law descended upon kids who smoke to join, while at the same time commercials, advertisements and sports sponsorships extol the benefits of tobacco and alcohol. Advertising has now been restricted or banned, and there are new laws to protect people from others' smoke. Yet many reform advocates want to solve the problem of society's inconsistency by swinging to the opposite extreme, without reflecting that a society that punishes tobacco smokers and allows free access to cannabis is no less hypocritical than its reverse. As a community, we need to get tougher, not softer, with drugs. All drugs, from painkillers to pet pills. For one thing, we have a peculiar consumerist attitude to visiting the doctor. Unless patients come away from the surgery clutching their prescription for a drug, there is an assumption that they would not got their money's worth, doctors complain. Well, it's about time that doctors got responsible and stopped pandering to such attitudes, especially as it is the taxpayer who pays for most of these prescriptions. Do you know that because it can destroy liver function and cause your organs to shut down, paracetamol, used in some painkillers available without prescription, can be much more dangerous than aspirin? Or that antibiotics have a range of thoroughly unpleasant side effects from nausea to thrush. A puzzlement in the cannabis debate is the reformers' willingness to ignore the harm caused by the substance. It's no worse than alcohol or cigarettes, the refrain goes. The cigarettes bet, yes, I accept, because nicotine is a vicious poison. But alcohol in moderation does not affect the body in any way remotely like cannabis, other than perhaps for good, as the latest research into a glass of wine with dinner indicates a relation to heart disease. For a start, cannabis is mostly ingested by smoking and therefore damages lungs in a similar way to cigarettes. As it contains over 400 substances, at least 60 of which are unique to it, plus on average substantially more tar and around 400% more particulates than tobacco smoke, heavy cannabis users risk chronic bronchitis, emphysema and lung damage, limited by the fact that cannabis tends to be smoked considerably less than frequently than tobacco. And if it was legal and hence more cheap and more accessible, it would probably be smoked more considerably more than it is now, especially as its production, unlike that of alcohol and tobacco, could be a nifty cottage industry. But that's not all. Smoking cannabis produces rapid heartbeat, dangerous to people who've got heart disease, and interferes with the delivery of blood to the heart, a risk factor for stress or exercise. It's got a variety of influences on hormonal systems and may hamper the sexual development of children and adolescents. It can cause permanent neurological damage in heavy users, and it impairs thinking skills, especially short-term memory and attention, so that regular usage may handicap educational achievement. It may also aggravate existing emotional disorders, interfere with psychosocial maturation, and may possibly reduce immunity to disease. Many of these effects have been known for a long time. As early as 1971, Psychiatrists Harold Kalansky and William Moore, in a detailed study, reported that mental changes, hallmarked by the disturbed awareness of the self, apathy, confusion, and poor reality testing, will occur in an individual who smokes cannabis on a regular basis, whether they are a normal adolescent, an adolescent in conflict, or a severely neurotic individual. The United Nations Commission on Narcotics concludes, cannabis is very dangerous. Extensive research has indicated that cannabis impairs short-term memory and slows learning, interferes with normal reproductive functions, adversely affects heart functions, has serious effects on perception and skill performance such as driving and other complex tasks involving judgment or fine motor skills, and greatly impairs lung or respiratory functions. A cannabis cigarette contains more cancer-causing agents than the strongest tobacco cigarette. Another problem with cannabis is that it is fat-soluble. Alcohol, being water-soluble, is mostly flushed out of the body in a matter of hours. Cannabis gets stored in the fat cells and may return to the bloodstream days or weeks later, maybe if we're dieting or we go too long without having a meal. So, its effects may be long-term and cumulative as well as immediate. This has implications not just for health but for activities like driving the car. Although cannabis seems to have less effects on driving skills than alcohol, its considerable effects on psychomotor control being balanced somewhat by greater caution when driving. It certainly delays reaction time, impairs perceptual motor control, decision making, attention and signal detection, and diminishes tracking accuracy, according to Griffith and Rebecca Jenkin in the research overview. Having a law against drinking and driving is manageable and enforceable with the .05 breathalyzer test, but the only way to have a similar law for cannabis with some sort of test is for consumers to be banned from driving altogether, given the fact that cannabis stays measurably in the body for such a long period of time. There is a possibility that the later release of the drug in the bloodstream will affect psychomotor control at the time. Yet, if you ask young people whether cannabis is harmful, and the great majority of them will answer in the negative. Over-the-top scare campaigns might have been at fault in the past for making exaggerated claims whose only consequence was cynicism. Today, however, it is the wimps who have gone to grass, many of them respected experts of one kind or another, who have gone to the other extreme by downplaying or ignoring the harmfulness of cannabis. At the very least, their concentration on arguing for decriminalisation comes at the expense of a focus on education. Young people are obviously not getting that information that they need about the drug, so their choices, good or bad, might be knowledge-based. The American experience is interesting. Between 1973 and 1978, 11 states decriminalised the personal use of cannabis. Since then, the trend has ground to a halt, and in 1990, Alaska, the state that went furthest in decriminalisation, voted by referendum to recriminalise. A major reason behind the change included increased knowledge of the dangers of cannabis, particularly on its weakening of the immune system. Another reason was research into the effects of Alaskan decriminalisation. By 1985, the US National Household Survey showed lifetime experience of cannabis among 12 to 17-year-olds to be at 23.7% nationwide and 51% nationwide in Alaska, a substantial increase. Government should not be in the business of encouraging health-threatening behaviour. Decriminalising cannabis sends the wrong message. Okay kids, we all know that tobacco and alcohol are bad for you and we're getting much tough on them, but cannabis? No worries, grow a plant in your backyard. The fresh air will do you good. And the pessimists who think that we are losing the plot in the drug wars should remember the words of George Santayana. Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Look at the countries that did not take a tough approach to drugs, such as China in the early 19th century, where the use of opium became so destructive that the emperor was driven to ban it. And even though this incurred the wrath of Britain, for which the trade was a nice little earner, and it precipitated the First Opium War. For centuries, hashish, a resin produced from cannabis, was freely available in Middle Eastern countries, with historians recording its damaging effects and rulers trying ineffectually to restrict its use, the "you can't put the genie back in the bottle again" problem. An Egyptian study in 1980 found that the effects of hashish to be serious for society, not least because it was those in the most economically productive years who were the heaviest users. Should we be sending kids to jail for first offence when many adults in responsible positions are calling for cannabis to be acceptable? No, that is not fair, but it is about time that those adults got real. When people in responsible positions start calling for discriminalisation, it is hardly surprising that drug use should become even more fashionable, or that drugs should proliferate amongst the young. Why only try cannabis with choices from ecstasy to cocaine and beyond? Drugs are harmful. Cannabis is harmful. And the people most likely to get hurt are the heavy users, who tend to be those who use drugs as painkillers. The kids who have tough lives that they want to forget. To soften the drug message, to accept cannabis, is to abandon the young people.